My name's David. Managing partner of Synergia, and thank you so much for making some time to come to spend your evening, a bit of your evening with me and a few of the other Synergia team. Learn a bit of stuff about systems thinking basics, and just want to acknowledge that you taking a little bit of your precious time to come here tonight. I really appreciate it. Hopefully what I talk about is useful. Have to be honest, it's been a little while since I've done this talk. I was looking back over some stuff over the last few days, pulling it together, and ended up getting all nostalgic, remembering some different sessions that I've done, finding photos of people I haven't seen for a while, and my wife kept saying, "Have you finished that presentation?" I was like, "Oh no, I keep looking at photos of different things and reading some different articles." So it was good actually to remind myself about some of it. What I used to do an all-day systems thinking course for different universities around the place. So it feels like sort of coming home to a university setting to do some of this. Although the technology is slightly different than it was 15 years ago, probably the first time I did it. There's a lot of screens in this room, so I'm not sure where to look. So if your eyes are all like looking at different places, which is pretty weird. But yeah, so systems thinking basics, approaches, tools and techniques. Tonight is about trying to give you a little bit of an intro, a little bit of a flavour of things that I've found really useful in my work over the last 23 years of sort of doing this stuff, and get you doing a little bit of hands-on stuff, because I'm a real believer in knowing enough of the theory, but you've actually got to use this stuff, and you've got to use it on a regular basis to actually learn how to do it. I play guitar, for example, fairly poorly because I don't practice enough. So if you actually want to learn this stuff and be good at it, you've got to actually practice. And there are techniques and there are rhythms and patterns that you need to get into. So you're not going to be an expert by the end of tonight, and I wouldn't profess to be either. It's a constant learning journey, this particular area. So a little bit of a flavour, and hopefully you've got something that you can go back to work with tomorrow and use as you need. That's our team. Photo's a little bit old, but Synergia's been around for 22, 23 years, and New Zealand-born company, primarily focused on the public sector, and I think a great group of people with all sorts of diverse skills. We use a range of techniques and things, including systems thinking. But we've got a few faces around the room as well. And tonight is part of the Synergia Learning Series, as we call it. So we started doing this about 18 months ago, probably. COVID slowed us down, like everything, a little bit. And we've run a number of different events over the last little while. These slides will be shared, and the recording and everything, so you can see people starting to write down some of those links. But all the various material and recordings of all these sessions are up there, and we keep picking different topics to share with people, and try and do an event every couple of months, like this one, and always open to suggestions. So a couple of these were based on what people wanted to actually see us talk about in the room. So yeah, it's good fun. Tonight, a bit of theory, explore some tools, as I've said, why and how to use them, do some practice, reflect and share, and I will talk about roosters a little bit. So just keep an eye out. I will explain, it will become pretty obvious as we get into it. But chickens and roosters do feature a little bit in this presentation. Systems thinking, a crash course. This is the little bit of, I suppose, a little bit of theory. And I should say that my colleague, Dr. David Rees, who has a PhD in systems thinking and who actually taught me at university many years ago in this stuff, is an absolute expert in all of this. And if you do get a chance to see him talk about this, it's an absolute pleasure, building on his sort of 40 years of experience of using this. So this is a bit of a crash course in it, from my perspective. So why systems thinking? Why do we want to try and use some of these tools and techniques? Some of this, I suppose, fairly standard and obvious statements. The environment we operate in, public sector primarily, is where we are, is complex. It's not complicated. It's complex. It's hard to understand. There's lots of moving parts. Overlapping policies and targets. One agency says this, another agency says that. Different sorts of pull me, push me targets that are happening. Quite often, see things in our work where someone's trying to achieve X and another agency's trying to achieve something which seems completely the polar opposite of it. And there's the push me, pull me type dynamics happening all the time. Pathways cutting across multiple organisations, so you don't have ultimate influence on the entire pathway or process or system. Actually, the things that you do are actually connected to other parts of the system. Leverage points for change or influence. Sometimes really hard to identify. Where are those? Where are the things, the levers that you might be able to pull that actually are going to make the greatest difference in what you're trying to achieve? And sometimes those leverage points are actually in someone else's context or someone else's agency or some other part of the system that you have no control over. Lots of data and information. Data being numbers and spreadsheets and various bits and pieces, but also data that's in knowledge in people's heads, experience, institutional knowledge, those types of things. And we hear this all the time. People come to us, or you hear it in a meeting. We must understand the whole system. We've got to take a whole system approach. And I jokingly, we often see someone turn up and they've got a picture of, and it's got all sorts of rubbish all over it. Dots and arrows and lines and carry on. And they say, look, I've mapped the whole system and I've used systems thinking. No, you haven't. You just put a whole lot of crap all over a page and it's got no rigor, no real understanding. It's just a whole lot of stuff dumped down. And actually, systems thinking is about actually using some tools and techniques which have a pedigree, have some rigor, have a history to them that actually, if applied properly, can actually help. So why systems thinking? Yeah, to say there actually is a body of work that says, let's embrace that complexity. We do actually have some techniques, some tools, some approaches, some ways of thinking that actually enable us to say, yeah, the world is complex, pathways, leverage points, lots of data. How do we actually make sense of this and understand it and make decisions as best we can, knowing all of that? Well, systems thinking, and I'll do a bit later if we've got time on system modelling, more specifically, if we've got a bit of time, really help us understand and embrace complexity. So what is a system? You've probably heard this if you've got an interest in systems thinking. Collection of parts that interact with each other to function as a whole. But they're more than just the interaction of some parts. And you can't just stick a whole bits of a car on the floor and go, it's a car. They're just all pieces of a car. You've got to put them together in a particular way. You've got to follow a set of rules. Actually, bits go in certain places to actually then function as a system as a whole. And you can't take something like a pile of sand, for example, there, and I could get a spade and I could make 3 piles or 4 piles or 5 piles. That same sand, if you actually put some rules and some structure and some various bits and pieces around it, can create a castle. It becomes something that's different than the sand that it was made from, the parts. A castle emerges based on the rules and the attraction and the bits and pieces that happen between it. And if I took a pile and I broke it in half into a couple of piles, that's fine. But if I take that castle and I cut it in half, I don't get 2 castles. I get back to probably a couple of piles of sand because I've broken the bonds between the various bits that actually make that system function as it is. Now it gets really complex when you start to add people into these things in social systems, and I'll get on to some of the reasons why. So when I look at things like systems thinking, it's the rules and the structure of how those parts come together that's critically important. We could use that sand to make 10 different types of castles, for example, and how they all come together. The other bit that's really important is you might see a castle. We've done this with lots of people. We won't have time to do it today. Is you ask people what they actually see. Some people see a castle. Other people see a church. We've done this before, or they see something else. So that people attribute meaning to what that emergent system actually is and what it means to them. So, and that comes from their beliefs, their history, their culture, whatever it might be. Dave Riso, I mentioned earlier, is Welsh, and when we talked about this, and he grew up in Wales, and castles mean quite a different thing to him because they represent power and money and a history, whereas for me, they're a tourist attraction. They're quite a different sort of thing. And if we were working with or presenting a presentation, which we've done, which David did recently, around Te Ao Māori approach, or Mataranga Māori, they were representing and using marae as the construct, not a castle. It doesn't mean anything, or waka. So those things mean things to people in terms of what they look like. Systems have feedback, delays, and unintended consequences. And I love this. I use it all the time. This guy here is swatting flies. So imagine he's a manager in an agency, and he's been given a target of, you've got to implement this policy. He goes, cool, bang, I've done it, awesome. But he set off a chain of cause and effect relationships, what's going to happen? As he's standing there in 3 weeks, 6 months, a year's time, however long it is, what's going to happen if the last domino falls? Where's it going to hit him? In the back of the head, right? So he's going to be standing there and, let's say 6 months' time, and go, whack, domino in the back of my head. What the hell was that? What happened there? How did that happen? There was feedback and there was delays. And from his perspective, it was an unintended consequence. What actually happened there? And what often happens is this guy he's not standing there anymore. He's been promoted because he did a really good job. Right? He implemented policy X, man, you got it done. You're out of here. Mary comes in, boom, domino in the back of the head, doesn't know what's going on. What happened here? So, and we all have feedback and delays are really hard to understand. In my experience, the concept of time in particular is really hard to understand and see particularly if it's a longer time frame, how an action that you've taken at a certain time has actually come back around and done something somewhere else in the system. And something happens, people go, why did that happen? That's really weird. You get that unintended consequence. So feedback and delays, unintended consequences, important characteristics of systems and of complex systems. Systems have a history and they have a future, and those two things are connected. We're going to do a bit of practice on this one in a bit, but the amount of times we get asked to come in and help in a situation where we've got a big waiting list for elective surgery, we've got a whole lot of EDs crowded, right? So people go, we've got 1,000 people waiting. Cool. What is the history? What does the pattern of that actual issue look like over time? So taking the time notion again, if it's the pink line and it's going up, okay, and the waiting list is 1,000, that's one way to look at it. Could be staying the same, could be going down, could be all over the place. If someone coming to us and saying that there's a bad waiting list, you need to understand the history of what that actual thing is. Because, if we've got a target up here, so that's good performance, that's what we're aiming for. Well, I might say, if you're on the pink line, keep going. No issue. You think that there's bad performance here, but actually what you're doing, because you're not, if you understand the history, we need to keep going. Versus if you actually are on the blue line and you want to get up there, doing this is a totally different set of actions, set of requirements, plans, whatever you might want to do. And if it's all over the place, you get my point. So you really need to understand the history of a particular issue, particular challenge, how it's got to today, and then where do you want to get to in the future are connected. So trying to get people to think over time and understand patterns, which brings me to probably my main bit that we'll come back to. We are often presented with challenges around events, and you only have to read the front page of the paper. Usually there's some dramatic statement. I always talk about it's the news story, the headline, number of people on a waiting list, huge number of people, huge government blowout is X. Well, and from a systems thinking perspective, we're trying to push down these layers, really try and understand, taking on the previous slide, what are the patterns of that particular event? How is it changing over time? What does its history look like? And what desired future do we actually want? Let's try and understand those patterns of behavior around that particular event. But you can't do anything about that particular pattern unless you actually understand the structure of the system. How are the bits of sand connected together? How does A connect with B and connect with C and connect with D? So that's where we might use things like systems modeling and mapping to actually understand, people using process diagrams and other sorts of things, different tools, probably not totally a systems-based tool set, but still useful to understand structure, the structure of the system, how all the bits fit together. And then really importantly, as you go down this, you're starting to get to the real meat, is what are your mental models that actually, how do you see the world? Is that a castle or is it a church? So how it's all put together can mean different things for different people. So if we want to influence that event and change its pattern, we have to understand the structure that is driving that behavior. It cannot change. Systems are designed to achieve the exact output they're designed to achieve. So if you want to change the pattern, you have to change the structure. You have to reorganize the bits, create a different castle, change the rules in which they are connected together. And you have to understand and sometimes challenge people's mental models about what is important. What are my cultural values and norms about why things happen in a certain way and why things are connected in a certain way. And we often use an iceberg analogy. Really all you tend to see is a bit of events and patterns sometimes, but actually the real meat is below the surface, is in the structure and the mental models. We can really understand those. Another way of depicting that is we've got things like, and you'll all have these in your organizations, we have them, policies, procedures, how money works, rules. It's really easy to see. We turn up for a piece of work, someone's got a problem, and they say, here's a box full of all our policies and procedures and strategies and manuals and stuff. Cool, thanks for that. We then say, who's got the power in the system? Where are the power dynamics? Who's actually in charge of the politics around here? Who's making decisions? Oh, we haven't written any of that down. Well, no, you don't. So you've really got to understand that. What are the relationships and connections between things, and what are the mental models? So it's a slightly different adaptation of the previous slide, but these things are very powerful and easy to see and sit on desks and get emailed around. But you often do not actually get into the things that have the real leverage, which is who's got the power in the system, where do they sit, and the relationships between bits and pieces. Couple more, and then we're going to get into some fun, is system boundaries, effectively. This goes back to my point earlier about people showing us diagrams of everything they can possibly think of put on a page. A linear way of thinking, or what people often, from my perspective, think about things, is we we do something and we put a filter through it of some sort of policy or practice that we're going to do, and we achieve an outcome. It's very linear. We do something and we achieve that. That's not untrue, but it actually sits within a complex web of interactions, relationships, power dynamics, and other bits and pieces. And when we want to look at intervening, we need to actually decide where our boundary is in our system, because we can't understand the whole system. So people coming along and saying we need to understand the whole system, I get where that's coming from. It's actually fundamentally false, and it's impossible to do. We need to actually decide what's in and out of what we're actually looking at, our system, our intervening system. So, and in this example, the intervention that you're taking is actually outside of the system that we were actually looking at, but it influences and achieves an outcome inside. So understanding where that boundary sits is a really important part of applying systems thinking rigorously and appropriately. Because achieving that outcome is clearly connected to a whole range of different sorts of things, and some of those things will be inside your boundary of understanding and knowledge, and some of those things will be outside. And sometimes we just have to acknowledge that, because you can't have everything inside your system of inquiry. So systems, collection parts, rules come together, manifest stuff, people see things differently. Feedback and delays critically important in understanding complex systems. They behave over time, have a history, have a future. We need to understand those patterns, moving from events through patterns, through structure to mental models. It's critically important. Systems have boundaries. We need to have some tools and techniques to understand how we decide what's in and out. Frameworks and tools to help us understand how we're going on. So from my point of view, systems thinking is a framework and a methodology and a set of really practical tools that have evolved explicitly to building an understanding about complex systems, embracing that complexity. Don't shy away from it. Actually, to really understand some of the complex social problems that we're trying to work on, we're working on family violence, suicide prevention, and other sorts of things. They're complex, multifaceted issues, and you really need a set of tools, we believe, to actually embrace that complexity and understand it fully. Otherwise, you break it down into its bits, and it becomes piles of sand rather than a castle at the end of the day. So, and it increases our awareness of the full consequences of our actions, so as to increase the likelihood, it's not certain, of achieving and sustaining our intended consequences. The likelihood is really important. So we're doing the best we can to intervene in something that we acknowledge is actually more complex than we can understand. So we're trying to use tools to understand and intervene as best we can to increase our chances of it being the right thing. So never profess to say that's the right answer or that's the perfect solution. It's the best one we can come up with the investigation and the amount of time we've had to look at this particular issue. And we're pretty confident that we've thought about things well enough that it's got a higher likelihood of achieving success than something else. Challenge anyone if they say I've got the perfect right answer for that in a really complex system. That will be the guy with the domino coming back around. Tools. Today, we're going to practice. I'm going to talk to you about boundary judgments. We don't really have time to practice that, but that's sort of, it's not really something you can sort of practice. Just, you can come back and look at the slides a little bit. There's not a huge amount on that. We're going to practice doing some reference behavior patterns or behavior over times, actually drawing some of those graphs and understanding how to do those. Once again, it might sound like a really simple technique, drawing some graphs, but it's really powerful. Causal loop diagrams, particular technique to get us to start to think about feedback and delays. You've probably heard these. If we've got time, which we'll see, there's a few other bits and pieces that I use all the time that are super useful when you're exploring a particular issue. They are not hard to learn, but difficult to master. So if we've got time. Boundary judgments. As I've said, one of the first things that we have to do is understand the boundary of the system that we're actually looking at here. So a whole system on a page. No, we need to decide and make decisions about what is in and what is out. Because there's certain things that if we're deciding something is outside the boundary of our system that we're actually looking at, we are effectively giving it a value of 0 in our thinking. So that's why I always try and think about it. I'm a bit of a mathematician, so I always think if it's on the outside of our system, then we're actually deciding to give it a value of 0. It has 0 influence on our thinking. So we have lots of debates during the start of and during projects where you do things like, do we need to involve social workers in this conversation? Well, if you're deciding to leave them out, they're outside of the boundary of the system. So their knowledge, their values, their data, you're saying are actually outside of the system. And depending on what you're looking at, you're making an explicit judgment to leave them out. Or clinicians, for example, should we engage with clinicians on this particular issue, or should we just stick with management? Yeah, okay. Well, there's trade-offs with doing some of that. You're making a call about what is in and what is out. Try and quickly read my notes, make sure I don't miss anything. So making judgments about what data is in, what values are important, and influencing the system. So it's always an interplay between these particular 3 components. And as I mentioned earlier, things like boundaries are often very contextual to what you're actually looking at. So contextual in work we do in New Zealand clearly has Māori and equity and kaupapa are inside our boundary. So I don't think there's a piece of work, and rightly so, that it's not inside our boundary. Whereas we're going to do work in Australia, and it can be quite a different boundary that they put on the cultural input into particular pieces of work. Yes, it's been changing over the last little while, but it's very stark, the difference about, they say those things tend to be outside of the boundary of influence, whereas we have them definitely front and center inside. So those different contexts are really important. You're basically saying, if I'm putting something inside the system, then it's something that I value and it's important for us to actually understand. If it's outside, I don't value that input, whether it be from lived experience or clinicians or management or whoever. We're saying that's going to be outside, or we're going to exclude that particular bit of data or that particular bit of information. So deciding where your boundary is super important.
I guess it's interesting, David, and who's in that conversation and who's shaping values. Yeah, which we see in the evaluation space a lot as well too.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, I've countless examples of a mental health piece of work that I did recently, and there was no lived experience voice on the steering group. So you sit down and you go, so everyone goes around and introduces themselves and say, oh, just a question about lived experience. Oh, we're going to engage them later.
Yeah.
So you're like, right, stood up, drew, right. So you drew a circle and said you've got clinicians, management, CEO, all inside this, you know, and you've got lived experience outside. And right, stop the meeting right now. We'll do it again next week. Make sure that lived experience are involved. And it's sometimes just because you don't ask, but that's a bit of an oversight by them. So when you explicitly said, so you're clearly not interested in their view and you're leaving them out. Oh, here we are, aren't we? Sort of It's just saying you're outside of the boundary of the system. I wouldn't say it like that. Say it a different way. It's jargony. So reference behaviour patterns. We're going to have a bit of a practice. I'm going to have a bit of a whiteboard. It doesn't really matter. It's pretty easy. You've got some flip charts and things on your page. What I want you to try and do at your table and have a little bit of a chat, get to know some people, about networking a little bit, is and you don't have to do it as an entire group. You can just do it as pairs, or you can do it on your own if you want. It doesn't really matter. Just have a little bit of a practice about how to actually look at a reference behaviour pattern. So what basically what you're trying to do is draw a graph axis, an X and a Y axis. You're putting a line down the middle for today, whatever, today's date. Pick a particular topic. So that can be something that you're working on at the moment. It could be, I don't know, you're trying to do something in your personal life. It doesn't really matter. You're just trying to practice. Pick a topic and name it. So I'm looking at waiting lists, or I'm looking at implementing something or other, or I'm doing something at work that you're trying to sort of do. A key variable about that particular thing.
There is a board there if you wanted one, but it's a bit far away. You're good.
It's a bit far away. Add a timescale. Is your timescale 5 years, or are we actually, you want to look at it's a really dynamic thing, so we need to do a week, or is it a long-term issue? So it's 5 years, 10 years, so 0 to 10, 0 to 5 on the bottom. Bad performance. I just always use a smiley face, a smiley face, a sad face. Sad face at the bottom, smiley face at the top. Up always seems to be better, usually in people's minds. Down means bad, up means good. Then I want you to think about the thing, starting at today, and go backwards. What's the pattern of behaviour of that thing actually look like? Now, you might want to draw a straight line or a wiggly line or whatever, but I want you to think about what that pattern of behaviour looks like for from today going backwards, 6 months, 12 months, week, on the particular thing you're looking at, and tell a bit of a story about what that pattern actually looks like. So we'll get people draw these graphs, and things will sort of go up and down, and often ask questions about, well, what happened at that point? And they'll go, oh, we got a new contract, or funding changed, or a new government came in, so the policy changed. So the thing dipped down, and it could be whatever it was, and back up. So it's quite interesting to look at those different changes in the behaviour and how they influence. And then think about the future. Where do you want to go, and how do you want to get there? So if good or bad performance is where you want to get to, what does that pattern look like? And what do you need to do along the way to actually get there? Learning from the past to then build the future. Now, pretty simple, not meant to be super rocket science, getting you to think about something over time, a particular variable, try and understand its pattern. That's all we're trying to do. 5 minutes, have a bit of a chat. But yeah, so first little practice, depicting something over time, trying to understand those patterns, those inflection points. Just encourage you to have a bit of a play with that. Getting you to think about moving from the event-based thinking down a level into patterns and behaviours over time. Is that thing going up or down? Is it all over the place, etc., etc.? And where do you want to get to in the future? So whenever someone in a meeting says, some of these statements, which you've probably all heard, we're really busy. Was it worse last week, or was it better, or have you been getting busier over time, and if they have, okay, well, what's been driving that? Oh, a team member left, or heaps for expectation. Okay, well, we all sort of do it implicitly sometimes, but actually you can practice some of it in those contexts. Okay, let's practice. We've done that. So here's my I get annoyed about type stuff. This is in the paper 2 days ago, I think. And the bit that really annoyed me was this. Well, it doesn't annoy me, but I get it. Media, all these event-based statements. Now you can make an assumption that they're good or bad, but implied to be bad the way they're written. But on June 30, there were 9 times in 24 hours. Well, was that better than the last 24 hours or worse? I don't know. So most times the things in the paper pick out the event, and I get it. That's what they have to do. But I think some of where people investigate, and it's been getting worse. This is a 10% increase on last year. This is actually contributing to a pattern of behaviour. Is actually so much more insightful. So I see it all the time. I've talked about some of this just in terms of time. These are the slides. It's moving from snapshots to movies. Causal loop diagrams. Next one. So causal loop diagrams is taking things a little bit further, where we're starting to try and understand cause and effect, and we're starting to try and understand what the structure of the system might actually be, and how things, the bits of sand, are connected together to generate the pattern of behaviour that we actually see. So, let's bring this up because it's easier. We've just been practicing a bit of a pattern of behaviour, drawing out on a piece of paper, a reference behaviour pattern. Well, actually, there's a bit of system structure, a simple bit of system structure in this example, that's actually generating that particular pattern over time. And in this case, it's chickens and eggs. So, I'll just joke, complex system today is chickens and eggs. It'll get onto the rooster, don't worry. So, how these work. We start to name various variables in terms of what we're wanting to look at. In this case, it's chickens and it's eggs. Chickens lay eggs, eggs hatch and become chickens. More chickens, more eggs, more chickens. So you get reinforcing, or R in this nomenclature, runaway behaviour. It reinforces itself. So interest in the bank, keep putting it back in, compounds, starts to exponential growth, etc., etc. So, and these little things are a plus, or in some textbooks it'll be an S, which means same. Plus indicates a positive relationship. So eggs up, chickens up. Equally, eggs down, chickens down. So they are a positive relationship with each other. They move in the same direction. If you have loops that are reinforcing like that, then you name them with an R and you'd call it something different. They tend to have runaway sort of behavior. So, in our very simple system, what if this was the boundary of our particular system that we're actually looking at? It's only chickens and eggs. What might actually happen here? Do you think there's going to be lots of chickens? There's going to be billions and billions of chickens, mountains and mountains of eggs everywhere, running around all over the place. They'll become the dominant race on the earth. They'll eat all the food, blah, blah, blah. There's no limiting factor to this particular system. We haven't actually put any limiting factors. So what might be a limiting factor on this particular system? Got any ideas? What are we going to run out of? Food? Space. There's just going to be there's no more room to have things you might know, sickness, whatever it might be. In our complex system, it's road crossings. Okay? These chickens have to cross the road, right? So, some chickens decide to cross the road after a little while. They've got to have a reason. And more chickens that cross the road means more road crossings. Unfortunately, some of them have an untimely death. So the more road crossings means less chickens, or a negative relationship. As this goes up, number of chickens goes down. Chickens goes down, road crossings goes down, because it's in the same or positive direction. And these loops are called balancing loops. So they tend to have counteracting or balancing or homing in type of behaviour, where you have reinforcing loops and balancing loops are the two that you have in the causal loop diagrams. And then you start to join these things together. So you start to get understanding the structure of a particular system. That's a very simple one. Where eggs are becoming chickens, chickens are crossing the road, which means less chickens, which means less eggs. Less eggs means less chickens. Less chickens means less road crossings, which means there's more chickens because they don't cross the road as much. It's very simple. So then you have more eggs. So you get this pattern. Does anyone want to hazard a guess about what the actual behaviour over time of this particular system might actually look like when you have a runaway loop, reinforcing, being counteracted by a balancing loop? It's only 3 variables. It's really simple. Anyone got any ideas?
Exponential curve.
Could do that. Asymptotes to a particular thing. Some people, it depends. What it ultimately actually does depend on are things like delays. Chickens need to be a certain age before they can walk. So there's actually a delay between road crossings. Not how many cars are going past. It's a whole range of other factors, right? So you might get a plateauing behaviour or a fluctuating behaviour where you get a boom and a bust type of thing.
How evolved
With
are
some-
chickens?
Sorry?
How evolved are chickens' thought patterns? Because surely if they saw, whilst they were waiting to cross the road, that their mates were getting bold, maybe they decide to go back into the egg and to stay into the same circuit, and they wouldn't bother going into the road crossing
They
one.
might, actually, yes.
I don't know how chickens.
So there could be a link where chickens, road crossings, they see someone get
Yeah.
run over, so they
Learn
go, no way,
Yeah.
I'm gonna
Yeah.
stay on my side of
Learn
the road.
behaviour.
and just
I
lay
mean,
the
I
rest.
don't know what their thought
Yeah,
of
meet
how
some more
evolved
roosters.
their thoughts are. I mean, I would have thought that KFC would have had an impact on.
KFC, yep, they're increasing the boundary of the system. Exactly. Anyway, so causal loop diagrams are once again quite a simple thing to learn. Very few rules, but they force us to start to think about feedback and delay and cause and effect between different things in a non-linear way. So we're going to practice. So, you guys down the back here, I was just overhearing, we're having a really good debate. Don't have an answer really to what they were looking at, but sort of once again trying to practice what you're doing. And I heard people really starting to tease out, does that really influence that, or is there something else in between? And that's where you get these simple things, as you started to say, you start to go, well, actually, there's another variable there. It's actually another loop off here for us to actually really understand this issue in more detail and more realism than what we're simplifying things here and doing it fairly quickly. So my top tips, however, with these, which is the danger that people can get into, is to try and list too many variables and create these sort of uber causal loop diagrams in one go. The best ones are actually where you've got the minimum number of things on the page, and it tells a really elegant, powerful story that underpins a particular position or hypothesis and describes how, from your perspective, your mental model, what the dynamics of a particular system actually are. So keeping it simple and elegant is actually, I think, better than having a huge big causal loop diagram, which you see around here, millions of variables in there, and everyone goes, once again, I got the whole system on the page. You go, but I've got no way of understanding this. This is completely all over the place. So if you can actually spend a little bit more time and write a shorter letter, as they say, I would advocate for that. Always focus on closing each loop. So making sure that what you're looking at has actually got some form of feedback. Feedback that's real. You can't make it up. If it's not there, then it's not there. So don't proceed by adding heaps of new variables just to try and make something work. Think about it a bit more. Draw a few reference behavior patterns. Is this actually the behavior that we're actually looking at? Use your diagram to tell a systemic and connected story. So some really powerful pieces of work I remember were around things like diabetes management programs, chronic disease. And we got people to draw some causal loop diagrams about how weight loss and other factors really, what it meant for them, people suffering from diabetes, got up and told some really powerful stories that clearly articulated their mental model of what the issues really were. And you could just see what the leverage points for them actually were in the system really clearly. So told a really compelling story, much better than a list of things on a flip chart, I would argue. Telling a story which had feedback, had delays, and had that connectedness that you get when you read a really good book, right? Things are connected together. So practice. I often do this, not as much as I should anymore, but grab the front page of the paper and actually go, government's saying they're going to implement this new policy around something like climate change, whatever the one was the other day. Here's what I think actually some of the dynamics are going on here. It's not about being right. It's about being about practicing and eliciting your mental model of what the key variables and key issues actually are. And you may actually have 2 or 3 different versions. Here's one way of looking at it, which is the, I believe in it. Here's the one that says I don't. Here's the one that says I'm impartial. All to get you thinking more differently about things. So I am wary of time. I'm going to go for about another 5 minutes, and then we'll have some questions and other bits and pieces. There's a whole lot more in this presentation, which you'll get. So I'm going to flick through a bit here, which is stock and flow maps and what's called system dynamics modeling, because I wanted to just talk about this other technique. So you'll get the slides. You can have a bit of a practice with this in your own time as well. And I'll circulate some articles as well about this with the material. Is that my sort of favorite thing that I do in the systems thinking world is use a technique called system dynamics, which is actually computer simulation modeling. So it enables us to take those causal loop diagrams and the behaviors over time, put them into the computer, and actually map out and try and really understand how these complex systems work. So we use a technique called system dynamics, which is based on stock and flow mapping, which has flows, which look like taps, stocks, and flows, and there's a few other bits and pieces. So the reason I wanted to show this is I just use this all the time, and it always surprises me how useful it is. Had someone come to me the other day. We're doing some work about a inpatient unit for a DHB that's rebuilding a mental health inpatient unit, and they have done all this work calculating the number of beds that it needs, and they've done heaps of work on looking at how many people come in and all sorts of stuff. They've done absolutely no work on how do we actually get people out. So always when we're looking at this, when people ask us like how many people are on the waiting list, or how many people are going onto the waiting list, how many people are coming off the waiting list, what's the flow in and the flow out. And 90% minimum, I would say, like 99%, how do we understand referrals? How do we look at assessments? How do we do all this stuff at the front door? How do we triage people? All these sorts of topics. How do we manage demand? How do we attract new customers? No one ever looks at how do we actually support people to be discharged appropriately back out into the community? What actually needs to happen out here in the system in terms of alternatives to inpatient units, other bits and pieces? It is a blindingly simple concept, and the amount of times that pieces of work, so much effort is put into describing and looking at the front door, and very little is looked at about how delayed discharges, how we're supporting people to actually exit particular settings, whether it be hospital or other bits and pieces. And when you look at that, there's a huge body of work around orchestrating the discharge, supporting people's transition to step down, those types of things. Has a huge impact on actually, the capacity that you actually need to protect the bits.
So tell me that you had a good outcome there, and that you got, you had the right people around the table.
It's actually, it's got nothing to do with the inpatient unit. The inpatient unit is what it will be. But they need to make a whole lot of investments in community-based services, step down respite, alternatives at the front door that actually divert people to different places. So you actually need to look at a whole lot of the different flows, whereas just complaining the unit's not big enough is pointless. It's pointless argument because you're not looking at the right things. And then when systems get a bit more complex, and you start to map like a whole sort of hospital and community system, it becomes absolutely impossible to do on a piece of paper. And that's where the computer modeling starts to look at, this is primary care assessment, sort of NASC stuff, acute hospital, medical, surgical, post-acute care, bits and pieces. That's only a snapshot of the model. So whilst it looks complicated, it's actually only built up with stocks and flows. And there's people moving around, in this case, moving around a system. We work with stakeholders like yourselves and say, where do people come from? Where do they go to? Where do they come from? Where do they go to? And all the little bits here, those are the boundaries of the system. That's where we're saying people are exiting this particular system in terms of what we wanted to understand from what we're doing and with this piece of work. One last thing that you can use which I always love using, rich pictures. So I did my master's thesis on rich pictures, which was great fun, and using them to build a performance framework for an organisation. But so I use them all the time and get groups of people to, once again, try to stop people writing lists of things and to actually think in different ways. So it's tried and tested systems thinking technique. Often not called a systems thinking technique, but if you read things, soft systems methodology, things like that, talk about using rich pictures. It unlocks a completely different part of your brain. It forces people to tell stories. This is the setup of the Mental Health and Wellbeing Commission session with their board. So getting them to actually tell the story. We videoed them then actually telling the story back to people, and we used those with staff. The richness of the story and what they told is so much more powerful than reading the strategy document and reading a bullet point list of a whole range of things. So it was very internal, but it unlocks a different part of your brain, forces you to think in feedback and think in loops and think over time. So I'd encourage you to do that. It's really easy to do. It's lots of fun. Had some hilarious experiences of people's pictures. Some of them quite inappropriate, but usually quite funny. So my final word, and then we can stop. So really quick intro to systems thinking in an hour. A couple of tools that I find really useful. Reinforce this bit on the right here. Always thinking about moving from the predominant view of events through to thinking about patterns and behaviours over time, structures using things like causal loop diagrams, system mapping, other bits and pieces, and pushing into things like mental models, using things like rich pictures and a combination of those other sorts of things. And the more you can actually get down here, the insight that you will get and the ability to actually tell compelling, connected stories that will influence change, I'd say you'll just see the power of it. We use these tools to develop insight and understanding, not the right answer. It's absolutely critical. There isn't a right answer. I always challenge people on this. Is the best answer at the right time at that time based on the amount of insight and understanding you can generate. You will only increase your proficiency if you practice and apply them on a real issue. So I'd say go back to work, start doodling in a meeting. Actually, that person's talking about something. I wonder what that looks like over time. Just practice. You'll only become a better guitar player if you actually practice. I know that. I don't practice enough. And I love these two statements, just to leave you with these two. From a systems point of view, everybody's view is partial and biased. And that's okay. So it's important to surface those mental models. We don't know everything, and we all come from a particular value perspective, life perspective, the things we understand, the things that we see in the world. So every view is partial and biased. So we have to do change together, because it's about bringing all of those partial biased views together, understanding them, putting them in the melting pot, saying we can actually bring those together. And all models are wrong and some are useful, is the other one that we like to. So any of those, even a really big complex model, it's actually wrong because it's got boundaries. You have to limit stuff everywhere. So once again, there's no right answer. They're all wrong. The test is it useful? Has it helped me gain better insight into the problem I'm trying to solve? And hopefully get more intended consequences rather than unintended ones. Cool. Any questions, comments? I'll stop there.